I don't think the grant makers need to be in the weeds. On the nonprofit side, they just want to make sure that it's somebody that has the skill set that's going to help them move forward.
Biggest question is, what are the common challenges that nonprofits have?
Nonprofits have a lot of challenges that they face on a daily basis. It's about intentionality and prioritizing.
When it comes to building capacity.
Yeah, I think grant makers have to walk a very fine line because nonprofits don't want to be told what to do beyond the dollar that they're receiving. Because some of these nonprofits, like I mentioned earlier, don't have room for capacity building. And part of it is sometimes you need to create mechanisms to call out certain things that are contributing positively to your organization and to call out certain things that might be contributing negatively to your organization. There's so many moving parts with nonprofits, and that's why it's important for grant makers to think about these nonprofits holistically and also to think about resources that they can provide to them beyond just funding.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Community Transformation Podcast, where we delve into nonprofit work. Today, we're going to be talking about grant makers' different multifaceted roles and how they can help different nonprofits more than just funding. So I'm here with Dale. How you doing?
Hey, Millie, how you doing?
I'm doing good today. So biggest question is, what are the common challenges that nonprofits have?
Millie, nonprofits have a lot of challenges that they face on a daily basis that requires some capacity building. Some of it, obviously funding is always a thing because they have to constantly be out there fundraising. Mm-hmm. But there's also other things like operation, running your team, looking at volunteer engagement, board dynamic, how the board itself operates, how the board is helping with the bottom line, but also the relationship between the board members and the staff. The community at times, social issues that's occurring that might be impacting the nonprofit, how the nonprofit voice their narrative and opinion to the greater community. There's so many moving parts with nonprofits, and that's why it's important for grant makers to think about these nonprofit holistically and also to think about resources that they can provide to them beyond just funding.
Can you give examples of those resources and how can they help them beyond that funding?
Yes. So a lot of grant makers have limited capacity when it comes to how they engage with the nonprofit that they fund. Mm-hmm. Some grant makers are not really substantially staffed when it comes to the team that's represented, because a lot of times they're focusing on deploying the funds, and then the nonprofit are the ones actually doing the work. But the grant makers themselves, especially if they've been around for a while, they have a whole lot of relationships within the greater community that they operate in. And it could be at a city level, at a state level, and sometimes nationally, depending on how big they are. The problem is they might not value those resources and connections and experiences that they've acquired for so long as important resources they can partake to the nonprofits. They might not value that. They might only focus just on the funding that they deploy. But the nonprofit themselves, because of the various challenges that they face that I just named earlier, are looking for resources, are looking for tips, are looking for guidance. And the grant makers can fulfill those roles if they allocate time, resources, and personnel to be able to help the nonprofit build their capacity in the areas that they might be struggling in. So how can they do it? Is by engaging with the nonprofits they fund in order to figure out where they are. And many grant makers have already systems in place, if it's annual survey or report surveys, where grant makers provide the nonprofit an opportunity to provide their feedback. So a lot of them already have this data, but they might not have the capacity, or they might not value that that's a type of resource they can provide to the nonprofit that could be very valuable to help them build capacity. In a lot of the work that we do, even most recently, we've played a bridge between a grant maker and a bunch of nonprofits, smaller nonprofits, that just started to engage with the grant maker with a particular opportunity where they had deployed some resources, funds that had limited requirements that went out to the community and nonprofits that valued it. And during those times of those listening sessions that we created some convening, a lot of the nonprofits were saying, because of the existence that this grant maker has had in the community, in the state, they feel that the grant maker should be more forward when it comes to providing some resources around capacity building, beyond funding that could help really them to propel forward. So on the grant maker side, I think it's important for them to have a strategy in place that focuses on helping nonprofits build capacity. Because those nonprofits, if they can receive those resources of how to strengthen relationship with their internal team or their board or how they position themselves, those could be the resources that they need in order for them to be more sustainable. And grant makers always love a more sustained organization because it reassures them that they can deploy the fund effectively. So that's kind of the important part and where the opportunity lies.
Well, I would have to ask, when it comes to building capacity, yes, the grant makers can help, but how can nonprofits do that in-house? For example, I know we spoke to a couple of nonprofits last week, and their biggest thing was the relationship with their board and their staff. So in that way, how can they build that capacity in their organization?
Yeah, so in your question, you're focusing more on the nonprofit themselves. Mm-hmm. If they identify that they have gaps and those gaps are impacting them negatively, what can they do to address those gaps when it comes to their own internal capacity? I think it's about intentionality and prioritizing. Sometimes there's certain areas where a nonprofit might not value the energy and time because they have other competing things that's pulling them away, like running a program, going to find funds, right? So they might not value if they identify that, oh, you know what, maybe we need to strengthen relationship between staff and board members. Or maybe we need to get our board members more involved or more engaged around certain things. It might be a bottom line that's in their mind, but they just haven't prioritized the particular thing because of other things that they do on a regular basis is pulling them, maybe because the constituents that benefit from the resources that they provide and the services, they value that time better to be allocated there. So I would say it's important to make time to address the areas where you have gaps. And to address it doesn't always require monetary resources, like a retreat, or to address it, sometimes it's just about creating space to have those honest conversation on what's occurring. And part of it is sometimes you need to create mechanisms to call out certain things that are contributing positively to your organization and to call out certain things that might be contributing negatively to your organization. But when you call it out, you have to create a mechanism where everyone becomes in tune with what's occurring. So then you can allocate time to flush it out. And what I've seen in many of my work, a lot of the nonprofits don't create that space to flush out things because it's sensitive. They don't want the staff to be in charge and involved in that process. They might not have resources to bring an outside consultant to come in and facilitate the conversation. But I would say it starts with the relationship between the board chair and the director. The director needs to be able to gather the information from the team, the staff, and be able to convey that information, positive or negative, to the chair. They got to be able to allocate time where they really dive deeper to dissect all the different moving parts. And then for them both to have a strategy of how they go about to handle the situation. Yes, certain problems will not change by the snap of a finger. You need to have a process in place where you can methodically approach and engage with those problems in order to try the solution. But that's where it starts. The director, the executive director, the director, whoever is in charge of the day-to-day of the organization, and the board chair to really work together to address this problem. Because the board chair can then work with the board to figure out, hey, if it's a capacity thing, if it's a resource thing, if it's an approval thing. But a lot of times, these situations and problems are dealt with separately. Yeah. We hear from the directors, and then we hear from the board chair. And a lot of times we say, well, if you all are in this mission together, why aren't you having this conversation? What's preventing you from having this conversation? And we find at times certain reasons are very artificial. It's, we've always done it. Oh, in the past this happened, so we don't really touch it. It's like, well, it's impacting you right now. It's impacting your effectiveness. You need to be able to address it.
So what if, in a sense, that the nonprofit doesn't have that professional ability to do so? Is there a way that a grant maker can provide that professional development to help them get to that point where they can analyze the two different points so that they can grow?
Oh, 100%. And I think that's where the opportunity lies, because most grant makers, if they've been around for a while, if they have a program director, a program manager, it will take some vulnerability from the nonprofit themselves to be able to disclose, hey, we need some capacity building around this area or this. But at the same time, they might also be scared to be that transparent, especially if it's an internal capacity where it's not like, oh, we're looking for new board members or we're trying to go to a training, where if it's like disclosing that there might be some dysfunctionality between the board and the staff, like you don't want to disclose that, right? Because someone might be like, oh, it seems like they're not doing well over there. So part of it is that transparency, but that honesty to be able to disclose it to the grant maker. And then the grant maker also needs to be, if it's a good size grant making organization, like you already know a lot of these moving parts that challenges many nonprofit. So you should have a strategy internally when it comes to how do you help build capacity. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're providing your own personnel team to do the work. It might be that you partner with a consultant group or an outside resource that will then work with the nonprofits. But you want to be able to think about building capacity of the nonprofits that you're providing funds in a holistic way, because the success of the dollar that you give will always rely on the effectiveness of the organization that you're trusting to run it. And if there's things that's happening within that nonprofit that's not strong enough or efficient enough, then already you're funding an organization where there is opportunities for them to not be successful or to not maximize on the resources that you're giving them because they're dealing with those internal issues. And that's why it's important for those the grant makers to be able to provide those additional resources around some of the subject that I named.
Okay, and then say, for example, they've already got the money. How can the grant makers develop that environment to continue that transparency from those organizations so that they can actually know there's a problem? Because even when we did our research, we saw that we had conversations with them, but when we went there, it's a completely different story.
Yeah, I think grant makers have to walk a very fine line because nonprofits don't want to be told what to do beyond the dollar that they're receiving. So grant makers have to have a holistic pulse on the different moving parts that nonprofits have in their everyday operation, from best practices, case studies, but also maybe the grant maker should have an annual or biannual surveys, convening gatherings where it just focuses on the health of nonprofits. And through those engagement and interaction, you will learn a lot of where those nonprofits are, just like how we do in our daily engagement when we're working with multiple partners. You get to learn so much about the things that's happening. So that's the number one recommendation is that grant makers have to be intentional of getting that information. Once they've gotten that information, then they got to figure out what resources and capacity we have to be an intervention. And the intervention, it might not be directly, it might be at a global level. So you do a webinar, you do a convening that focuses just on the areas where nonprofits express that they have gaps, but you bring in folks that have the skill set and the subject matter expertise that could really dive deeper for them to dissect and digest and figure out where potential solutions that they can put in place to improve their experiences. But if you do it at a global standpoint, then it's not invasive. But you got to know what's occurring, right? And you know what's occurring by having surveys, listening sessions, and then you might provide that experience at a global. So you might say, hey, every quarter we're going to do a workshop or a training that focuses on helping nonprofit build capacity. So one month, one quarter, it might be on effective board policies, right? But that's in a global, right? But you're a trusted grant maker. So if I see that and I run an organization, if I see that and I already trust you as a grant maker, I'm like, whoa, they have how to run an effective board. Let's send this out to the board chair and see if we can get some people to go to this. Maybe another quarter is how to have an effective fundraising strategy. Whoa, that's amazing. They're going to cover this. All right, we're going to send our development person to the training, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the less invasive way because that's global. And it shows that you know the different moving parts that's happening and you're providing a tunnel. And then if you have resources and you're seeing that people are reacting to it and are receptive to it, then you can maybe deviate. Maybe if you have a general fund grant, you say, well, we want to allocate certain grant just around capacity building. Maybe we do a $5,000 to $10,000 quarterly that goes out to maybe 20 nonprofits that needs capacity building. And sometimes if you're like hesitant about, are they going to really use the money for it? What if they found the consultant or the intervention, and then if they provide the information, you're paying them directly instead of the money going through the nonprofit, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be the strategy where you do stuff at a macro level, and then on the micro level, what you learn and how people are responding, you start providing internal resources that does that. We've engaged with certain grant makers that are starting to do it, especially coming out of COVID, where they realized that they couldn't fund certain organizations because of the requirement, but they made a commitment where they would fund for capacity building. And I think it just has to be ongoing. It has to be embedded. And part of it too is that the grant makers themselves might have a more reputable relationships with outside resources that if they co-signed, it might be a pathway for some of these smaller nonprofits to actually get folks or organizations that provide the resources to want to be involved and engage.
Could you give some examples on how, if the grant maker doesn't have the ability to do such things that you said, but instead they hire a consultant, how can they intertwine themselves with the consultant so that the nonprofits still feel that it's coming from the grant maker instead of just another third party?
That's just funding. I don't think the grant makers need to be in the weeds.
Okay.
Unless if they have subject matter expertise where they want to drive it more hands-on internally. Mm-hmm. But on the nonprofit side, they just want to make sure that it's somebody that has the skill set that's going to help them move forward. So if the grant maker doesn't have the capacity to be hands-on on that, mm-hmm. if you're funding it, just find a bunch of consultants or resources that you have seen that they have a proven track record, and then allow them to engage with the nonprofit directly. And then you want to have a reporting mechanism in order to make sure that things are working well. But yeah, the grant makers themselves don't need to be in the weeds versus providing the resources. So they can mm-hmm. just fund it. And then they have certain criteria that they're looking at in order to ensure that the positive impact is actually occurring. But yeah, I think it varies. If mm-hmm. they want to be in the pulse of it because they realize that it's a solution that they want to continue to provide, mm-hmm. then yeah, you're going to have to allocate some internal resources or work closely with external partner that does the work, but you're getting more of the insight on a consistent basis as part of your business and operation as a grant maker. But I would say to not be hesitant to play that role in whatever way that it makes sense, just because it's the most impactful thing if the services are good that some of those nonprofits can get in order to help them improve.
So what if maybe you're providing those services from a consultant, but the nonprofits are kind of hesitant because they don't know this consultant? Is there ways that the grant maker can make them more comfortable into it, or kind of assure that this outside consultant can help them?
Yeah, I mean, that's just a credibility thing. I don't really worry about that too much, because I believe that it's important to have skin in the game, right? Where sometimes folks want to control how a resource is allocated to them, especially when it's non-program related, right? Like something like a capacity building, like, well, what is it worth? How do we trust that they're going to deliver, right? There's a lot of distrust sometimes that people go into when something is very prescribed and the resource is not allocated in a way that they might value it based on their bottom line. If it's like program or staffing versus like, hey, we're going to pay for your capacity. I do think that the nonprofit has to have skin in the game, and seeing that, hey, these efforts being put forward and you have to go along in whatever the requirements are for that the grant makers put in place, so you can benefit and maximize on the opportunity of having an outside consultant that's coming in to work with your team to build the capacity. So they need to be able to move beyond that so they can leverage it, versus being apprehensive and standoffish. Because at the end of the day, it's like, if that's a resource there to help you that you need, and you're getting this opportunity, you want to maximize on it. So I would say, yeah, I mean, the grant makers can definitely play a bridge of providing credibility of that particular consulting group or the resource, so the nonprofit feel more confident and comfortable to work with them. But they shouldn't have to go like out of their way in order to get the nonprofit on board of receiving the services. But we see that often in our work. I mean, we get sized up often, especially when we're playing a bridge. And I think the thing that works well for us is we go into the relationship very transparent with our vulnerability, stating that we don't know what we don't know. Part of our process is to get to know you all. And as we get to know you, we'll identify the areas that you need support and help. But we don't have any preconceived conclusion. So help us better understand who you are, right? And I think that helps, because the people that are on the receiving side of it, the organizations that are on the receiving side, they feel that genuine. They say, okay, these folks, even though they're the expert, they're stating that they don't know how we do stuff, and we help them understand it. And when they learn more about who we are, that's what's going to help them figure out how they can help us.
Going back to one of the different resources that grant makers can provide, networking. Can you tell us how that is important, especially when it's networking from other recipients of the grant? Yeah,
networking is really critical, because grant makers that have been around for a while have a huge network of community members, vendors, consultants, city officials, towns. And it's really important for them, the grant makers, to play that bridge, to be the ones to call, send emails, set lunch, dinners with the people that provide the services, because the grant maker might definitely have more credibility, and folks will be more receptive to give you a chance if they're co-signing, especially for smaller nonprofits that are just upcoming. Because they might not be fully known outside of their small circle. So by a grant maker doing that, it goes a long way. And it's critical. And I think grant makers have to realize that, like, that's part of services that they can offer in order to gain value from the nonprofits that they're trying to build relationship with. Because that's capital. That's big capital, you know, for you to just pick up a phone and say, hey, I'm working with so-and-so and they're doing this, they're doing great work. They want to reach out to figure out, right? Like that goes a long way. And grant makers need to do that more and more.
Any last tip for grant makers, especially in the multifaceted roles that they will have working with nonprofits?
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, I would say that if you're a good sized grant maker, you want to allocate some time internally where you have a person who works for you that just focuses on capacity strategies for nonprofits. And that person becomes like a resource hub. As different folks are identifying challenges that nonprofits are facing that might be in their grant pipeline, you can be more targeted in how you recommend certain things. And that will come with conferences, convening, different things that you put in place in order to address the capacity of these nonprofits more than just the funding that you might give out. I think that should be embedded as part of the service grant makers provide to nonprofits. Because you know so much. If you're a grant maker, you've been around for so long. And some of those requirements that you have in your grants, like you need to be able to show folks how they can get to that, you know, get to those deliverables or show that they represent those things, because those are the things that a nonprofit might struggle showing that might exclude them from being a grant recipient. So I think it's really critical. And if you have limited resources, find ways to curate resources that are out there and then use that as a resource that you send out to different nonprofits so they can get the resources that they need to grow and feel effective. Because some of these nonprofits, like I mentioned earlier, don't have room for capacity building at all. So that would be my recommendation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for tuning in today. Join us next time for more insight and stories in the world of nonprofits and grant making.
Super. Thank you, Millie.
Yeah.